Okay, so we're going to get started. My name is Eric Bradner. I am a reporter for CNN. I cover national politics, but I am also a Franklin College alum. Graduated from FC in 2009 and have stayed connected. I've been teaching a class here for a few semesters, and my in-laws live about 3 minutes away. So I get back to campus relatively often, and it's good to be here today. I'd like to get started just by introducing everybody on the panel, and I'm going to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about who you are, where you work, and what your sort of introduction to journalism in this space of trauma was, when you sort of first encountered it, and also a little bit about how you sort of deal with this in your daily life right now, right? So let's start on, Scott, we're gonna start on your end, and I'll just kick it to you if you don't mind.
So I'm the oddball in the group. My name's Scott Thomason. I'm a retired federal agent. I was the chief of firearms for ATF. I'm a criminal investigator by nature, by trade, and I believe I'm the one on this panel because I've done, every interview I've done was, I guess you could say, trauma-based with regard to victims of crime, family members of those who have lost someone special in their lives. So it's more from an interview-based, how do you interview somebody, get the information out of them and not cause any damage or harm to that individual, yet still accomplish your job. I was probably introduced to trauma from the first day I raised my hand and took an oath of office back about 35 years ago. So, I mean, everything we did from homicides to bombings to shootings to mass shootings and school shootings.
Jill?
Hi, my name's Jill Sheridan. I'm a public radio reporter at WFYI in Indianapolis. I'm currently on the city beat, but I previously was on the health beat, which is when I would say I was first introduced to trauma reporting on the health beat. Certainly you're talking to people that have gone through something that is going to be extremely difficult, that's going to be extremely personal, and you're going to be asking them questions about what may have been, the worst day of their lives. So that's when I was first introduced to talking with people that have had, great trauma in their lives. And then on as a city reporter as well, especially in the criminal justice realm, you will find yourself reporting on and with many people that have experienced trauma.
Sammy?
Hey, I'm Sammy Kayola. I currently work at WHYY News, which is the NPR member station in Philadelphia. I'm a gun violence prevention reporter, which tasks me with doing solutions journalism around the gun violence crisis in our city. But I really started doing trauma-informed work at my last job, which is Capital Public Radio in Sacramento, California. And I did this really intensive 2-year project with survivors of sexual assault. And it was all about reporting a sexual assault to law enforcement and the secondary harm that can come when you go to someone who you are hopeful is going to help you, and you then experience more harm trying to navigate that process. And we did a 7-part podcast. We worked with 8 survivors over 2 years in this very tailored situation. We call them a survivor cohort, and I'll probably talk about this a lot, but we said from the bat, this is going to be a trauma-informed project. This is going to be a collaborative project with the survivors. It was very unconventional. My newsroom put a lot of resources into it. Long story short, survivors told us that it helped them heal. It really worked. It really worked, and we got really important information out and actually changed the way that law enforcement does their jobs when people report rapes. So that was what I was doing before I took this job. Now I'm kind of a breaking news reporter on gun violence, and I'm trying to figure out how do I take the skills that I learned in that long form setting and apply them on the streets of Philadelphia. And sometimes it's gone great, and sometimes it's been bad. So I'm just here to learn, and thank you all for being here.
Hi, my name is Javier Garza. I'm a journalist based in northern Mexico. I do mostly local news, and so my introduction to trauma began somewhat in mid-career as an editor of a newspaper when we began receiving threats and being the target of attacks by drug cartels who were unhappy with some of the stories that we were running. So basically my experience has had to do more with running a newsroom and managing a staff of people who are scared, who are nervous, who are uneasy about the job that we're doing, and making decisions that could get somebody in trouble, that could put somebody in danger. So that was I'd say my exposure and how I began to dwell into this issue. I hadn't really considered the stuff of trauma for the first, I don't know, maybe 15 years that I was working in journalism, even though I had some experience in traumatic situations. I had never really considered, just considered it like part of the job, until it really hit hard and started having a deep psychological and physical impact in the way that we were covering a very particular story, which was criminal violence in my community.
Well, first of all, we've got an audience here that's, I think, mostly college students, right? I know there were some high school students. Are there any high school students still here? No? Okay, cool. I want you all to ask questions. This is a room of journalists. We interrupt people. We're used to being interrupted. Jump in. If you got something you want to talk about, don't be shy, please. But in order for viewers of the live stream to hear the question you're asking, I'd ask that you please just hang tight long enough for us to get you a microphone. Your voice will carry in this room, but it won't be picked up on camera. So I want viewers to have the context of any questions you might want to ask. So I want to start really simply, and this is going to sound like a bit of a goofy question, but entering a reporting situation where you're approaching someone who has been through a traumatic event, whether that's a natural disaster or a shooting or anything else. One of the first decisions you have to make is how to approach them physically. And that doesn't just mean how do you walk up and introduce yourself. It means what decisions do you make about how you get there, where you park, what you wear that day, what you carry with you into that situation. And this is something that I personally started to become aware with when I was a 19-year-old intern, and I got sent out to cover a triple murder that had turned into a manhunt, and it was in a very rural portion of Indiana. You had to drive on dirt roads for about 20 minutes to get there. And I'm 19 years old and I'm trying to look professional, so I show up wearing a suit, right? And I'm knocking on the doors of these people who are a little leery anyway. And I remember somebody's grandmother kind of looked at me and sneered a little bit and said, "You're fancy." And I realized kind of right in that moment that I had not approached that scenario in an effective way at all. And I wonder if you all have some lessons that you've learned, and I'm going to just leave this open to anybody that wants to jump in. Some lessons you've learned about how to approach situations where you're going to ask people to let you ask them tough questions, have difficult conversations, just about how you sort of enter that situation physically. Does that make sense? And does anybody want to jump in? Okay, great. Sammy, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I would love to. Trust building takes time, right? The opposite of parachute journalism, which is what some of the speakers this morning talked about. You go, you stick a mic, you leave. The opposite of that is community engagement. And that's like a buzzword, but what it really has meant for me is like spending time in the neighborhoods where the shootings happen when there's not shootings. like going to town halls, going to after-school programs, like making it known that I'm a reporter who is invested in these communities. Because I want to know, who are you? Who are your kids? What do you think are the solutions to gun violence? Like, what gives you hope? And when you're a known entity, then you can actually show up and people are like, oh, that's just Sammy, she's fine, come on in. But it really takes time, and you really have to convince your editors to let you, become not part of the community, but at least a known person. Like, I'm white and I'm not from Philadelphia, so like there was a lot of like kind of cultural stuff I had to learn, trust that had to be built. But you can do it if you go in with this perspective of like, hey, I'm just here to listen. Like I'm not getting a story right this minute necessarily, but I just like want to know what you want me to know. The other thing I want to say about showing up is, so Kate Porterfield is a psychologist who works with the DART Center, and she said once, a surgeon doesn't show up for surgery like having just eaten a hamburger in their car and pick up a knife. Like they have a process, they wash their hands, they put on scrubs, because they're doing surgery and you can do harm. And I actually think when you're interviewing people who have experienced trauma, like you can harm them. Like you are talking about really heavy, complicated topics, and you have to approach that with care. And so like you can't be running from another assignment and texting your editor and eating a hamburger in your car. Like you have to stop and be like, why am I here? Who is this person? And how can I have an experience for them that's going to make them feel, if not empowered, if not healed, at least like safe. And there are tactics for that, but I don't have to go into those right now.
Yeah, please jump in.
So I think you have to look at it as an interview, right? I mean, it is an interview, and the person that you're interviewing, what you may consider they have trauma or not, whether they may have trauma or not, it really kind of depends on their own background. But it takes about 30 seconds when you first meet somebody and see somebody, and they're going to make a judgment or decision about you in that first 30 seconds. And then in the next 3 minutes, what they're going to do is they're going to either validate that decision of, I like this person, I don't like this person, he's trustworthy, she's trustworthy, he's not. And then in the next 3 minutes, they're either going to validate it or they're going to flip it on its head. And I think, to Sammy's point, if you come out with just a very true, caring, how are you doing? I'd like to talk to you about this. Can you tell me what happened? Not how do you feel, go right to the emotions. You have to assume that they have some trauma. So not only are they sitting there trying to figure out whether you're trustworthy or not, but they're also they have to be able to not only are they trying to figure out if they trust you or not, but they also are trying to distinguish whether you're a threat or not, because they're actually guarded. And in that 30 seconds, they're looking at what you're wearing, how you're composing yourself, if you're too busy. If you ask a question and then just get on your phone and start texting, are you really paying attention to them? So what you have to do is give them 100% of your focus. You have to dress appropriately for the area, dress like a local. But more importantly is you just have to connect with them. And how you connect with them is, how are you doing? You may be interviewing somebody who's just a witness to it, or may have heard something. You may make news and they may tell you who actually did it, but they never even talked to the police because the police didn't ask them. So you have to look at it and build that rapport, and then just let them tell their story in their own words from beginning to end, and then pay attention. Then you start becoming a journalist and start asking the questions back on, what about this, what about that, did you see this, did you see that? And those questions are a lot easier because you're helping them clarify their statement.
And Jill, I think we've all conducted these sorts of interviews, made these approaches where sometimes it's clear that the subject is going to be willing to talk to us. Sometimes it's clear that they are definitely not. But there's a gray area.
Yeah.
And as these subjects, as you kind of feel yourself being sized up, right? You're trying to figure out a way in, a way to get them to at least give it a try. What are some of the tactics that work for you, that you go to in those conversations, in those moments, to try to sort of break down some barriers?
Eye contact, a smile, even if it is a really traumatic situation. I'm thinking of when we covered the FedEx shooting in Indianapolis. And I was in the parking lot the day after with a lot of the people that still didn't know what had happened and were waiting to hear about their family members that worked at FedEx. And they were all taken to this hotel, and during that process, you could tell that obviously people were didn't know. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of sorrow. I ended up talking to a lady whose husband had been killed, and she was still waiting to find out at the time. But when you're approaching people, just be gentle as well, especially in a new situation like that that's breaking, that's changing constantly. And again, eye contact goes a long way to sort of understanding who will speak with you and who might not be ready to yet. And really opening yourself up, I mean, even non-verbally, physically, to let them know that, I'm gonna listen, I'm not talking. If you're willing to, share with me, I'm here. And again, even if that situation is moving and fluid and changing, just stopping and focusing on that person can really, really help.
Javier, you have had to approach people while also dealing with the threat of cartel violence. I mean, that's the physical threat to your safety is something I think journalists in Mexico deal with that in the United States we often do not. That has to add a layer of complexity. And I wonder how you manage to sort of break down barriers with difficult sources while at the same time protecting your own safety.
Well, precisely because it has a layer of complexity, it means that every situation is different. So there is really not an approach except to say that you have to read the situation and you have to be quick to think on your feet. You guys are probably going to think that I'm going to make this up, but this is actually true. And this was the best lesson that I ever received. Actually, before becoming a journalist, I was watching an afternoon newscast in my hometown, local news on TV. And there was this guy, he was like a veteran. He was more a veteran news presenter than a reporter, but somehow he had been assigned, I guess, to cover. There was violence in outside of a school, and it turns out that a kid had been stabbed. And he goes to interview the mother, and I am not kidding, but he said this on TV, "Ma'am, your son just got killed. How do you feel?" And I mean, the obvious response to that is, of course, don't ask stupid questions, right? I mean, I honestly don't know what the guy was thinking, but it was like the best example of what you should not do. And the lesson there is not don't ask stupid questions. The lesson is think. Think the moment you are about to approach and read the situation. And how do you, for example, approach a person who has just witnessed a shooting, right? In which, because we had some of these cases, people that were like in restaurants or bars and there was a shootout and they saw people actually die there, maybe friends of them. Sometimes it's just as easy as what happened, right? And sometimes they would have an urge to talk because it's also a psychological impulse. It's hard to tell who might have that impulse to talk, but if you don't ask the question, you're never going to get an answer. So if you strike out with one person, maybe you have to move on to the next one. If your intent is to actually get the story, eventually someone will tell you. And maybe just asking, tell me what happened, and just listen. You don't have to ask anything else. You don't even have to ask for details. I mean, did he turn right or did he turn left? Sometimes that is just intrudes on the story that these people want to tell because they are just unwinding, they're unloading because they need to unload the experience that they just had. You can pick up the details later. The hardest part, the hardest for me, for example, is to deal with relatives, especially mothers and fathers of victims, How do you get them to talk? What I found out is after you tell them that you're a reporter, if they agree to speak with you, is that they want to talk with you. And usually those people are seeking some kind of justice for what just happened to them. You don't try to pose as the people who is going to deliver them the justice. You cannot give them the false hope that if they expose their story on the media, they are going to get the justice that they seek, because usually doesn't happen. Rarely happens actually. But to me, the key is just listen, right? And don't intrude in the story that they're telling you. I guess, going back to the original point about reading the situation, sometimes you are probably going to screw up, right? You have to be quick on your feet to sort of change tactics. I remember once it was a rare thing that happened. I heard that there were two women who were migrants, one from Honduras and one from Nicaragua, that ended up in a hospital in the city where I live. One of them they were coming on a train. One of them had to get off the train because she was pregnant and she was in labor. The other one fell off the train and she got her legs cut off. So it was this impressive, incredible contrast, between the woman who just delivered a baby and the woman whose journey to the United States has been literally, cut because she lost her legs. They were both in the same hospital, and I remember that I went there with a reporter, and it was how we had to change our attitudes, the way we talked, the way we asked questions when dealing with a woman who had just confronted the tragedy of getting her legs cut off. And then with a woman who had just delivered a baby, and it was like almost schizophrenic in the way that we kept going back and forth. And that was a big lesson on, how to sort of be quick and to think on your feet on how you need to approach each situation.
Sammy, for your podcast after the assault, were your subjects, did you approach them knowing that they were interested in talking, or did that take some time?
So actually, they reached out to us. It started with one survivor who sent an email to our managing editor and said, look, I just reported a rape to SAC PD. I had this awful, awful experience. I'm not the only one. Can you do something? And at the time, I was the only female reporter at my station. And our managing editor was a guy. And he came up to me and he was like, hey, do you want to check this out? I was like, yeah, let me at least meet with her. You can't know until you pull the records whether something is a systemic problem or not, but it was. The clearance rates for rape in our county were really, really, really low. And we just started interviewing experts. We learned that a lot of cases, they don't even make it to the DA's office. It's very, very, very hard to prove certain kinds of sexual assaults, especially if it was in private, if the survivor doesn't report right away, there's not a lot of evidence collected. So we just sort of put out a call for women who didn't get justice or didn't get the kind of justice they thought that they would get. We did flyers, we went to the local rape crisis center, we had a survey that we sent out. So I didn't really have to track people down per se. We just kind of said, hey, here's an issue that we're aware of, we think it's important. If you want to work with us, please let us know. And I interviewed probably 20, 23, something like that, women, but we ended up with 8 in the core group. Because we said, do you want to be part of a storytelling cohort where you're going to be involved with this project for a year and you're actually going to have some agency in how this story is told. I'm still the reporter, my editor is still the editor, but you're in this. You are helping us figure it out, to the point where I would write episode outlines and I'd share the Google Doc with the outline sketch with the survivors, and I'd be like, did I get this right? Am I missing something? And one of the survivors was like, you need a 7th episode. And we did that episode, right? And it was morally and financially weird for me because I was working and they were not. Like, they weren't actually financially compensated for this, and that's a whole thing in the industry about, like, you can't pay your sources, and we had a lot of conversations. What we did do was, like, we paid for their transport to the studio, we paid for babysitting, we had a mental health specialist at all of our meetings who did that work pro bono, which was awesome. And ultimately, these women were like, I have to do something. Like, this horrible thing happened to me. I didn't get justice. If talking to this reporter can make me feel like this matters, that something might change, like, they wanted to do it. So then it didn't feel exploitative. It felt collaborative. But it just was we had to really tailor the situation. And I just wanted to go back quick to, like, asking about details. This is something I learned working with sexual violence survivors. Place, time, the chronology of things. Often the way that memory is encoded during trauma, they can't really access that. Like, they don't remember it, it's scrambled, and they get really, really stressed out when you ask a question that way, so that's something to be careful about.
That's why it's disruptive to the flow of the conversation, and then you can screw it up if you actually start asking about that.
Yeah, so, if you can keep it vague, if you can let them just, what do you remember? Really vague. The other thing is control. I think this morning you might have heard who said that, like, when people experience trauma, it's a loss of control. So we tried to give control back. We were like, you choose the location, you choose who you want to have with you. If you want to have your friend, if you want to have your husband, we'll come to you. We had one survivor who was like, okay, I always want to do interviews on Tuesdays because Tuesday I have therapy. She wanted to talk to me and then she wanted to go to therapy, right? So just as accommodating as you can be to try to help them, feel like they have control in the situation.
And I wonder if others might have some thoughts as well on how you would cultivate a network of sources, right? So you've found an interesting angle, right? You found an interesting person, an interesting subject, but you've also realized there's a bigger story here, and you need to meet more people, hear more of their experiences.
Let me just, to a point that Sammy was making about the details, I found when I was doing reporting on actually a school shooting that happened in my hometown, technology gets the details now. And so you don't have to ask somebody, so what time did that happen? Well, between 9:30 and 10 when it's on the their messaging app, right? And they have the exact same. I remember talking to the brother of the teacher that was killed in that shooting, and he was telling me about how he kept sending messages to her sister because when he heard about the shooting and wanted to ask about her, the chronology was all there, was all in the chain of text messages. So I didn't have to ask him about that. And if you ask him about that, it sort of disrupts the whole flow of the conversation. But it's easier now to get some of the details because everything seems to be time-stamped. About contacting sources, also something that Sammy was saying about the difference between parachute journalism and living in a community, is you develop that. You develop the trust to approach the people, and even if the people that you are approaching, even if you don't know them, when you live in a community, it's more likely that you know someone who does, right? And so you know people who can vouch for you and who can tell them, well, you can ask them, well, can you speak to so-and-so and ask them if he or she can talk to me? And they can vouch for you in the process. It's a slow, it goes on forever. It's just really something that never stops. The way you develop your sources, the way you develop your relationships, so that when something happens, you can, you know more or less which buttons you need to push and which people you need to contact in order to get to the people who would have the most accurate information about the story.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I mean, it's relationship building. I've been reporting in the same community for 15 years. Knowing people that know you can help a whole lot because people are going to say that, yeah, Jill's okay. She's going to listen. She's going to be fair with your story. I think it's also helps being in public media, as opposed to, we heard, during the discussion earlier about, the broadcast news channels, the national news channels, and I think broadcast news always is going to have that challenge because of the time and of the way that it is disseminated across the broadcast world. But in public media, we have a little bit more of an understanding up front that this is a trusted source. And I think that does help as a public media journalist.
There's a great similarity between journalism and law enforcement, believe it or not. I know a lot of people think they're at opposite ends, but they're really not. And if you want to set yourself apart from all the other journalists, go out and get a nice stable of sources, because it's the ones who have the sources that know what's going on in a community that are always going to be a step ahead of everybody else. As she can probably tell you, she probably had police sources that you could pick up the phone and say, hey, what's really going on here? And they would tell her. So when you develop a source, isn't when something bad happens. You develop a source prior to anything bad happening. It's, hey, you want to go get a cup of coffee? Hey, you want to go grab a beer? Or you happen to see them at the grocery store, because they're going to be within your police beat, and you just be a human being. Let them know that you're not trying to get something out of them. You're just kind of trying to make that connection, build that rapport, develop that source, let them be able to trust you. And then once they're able to trust you, then you pick up the phone, and they will deal with you greater than somebody else from out of town. The point you were touching on, in school shootings, and I've worked many a school shooting, too many, one's too many, but I've worked many. And I'm always amazed because the local journalists are at such a great advantage over the national media, because they know the policemen, they know the sergeants, they know the captains, they know the investigators, they have their phones, they can text them, and those police officers have no problem giving you information as long as it's not for attribution, most times. And that's the advantage that local reporting has over national reporting. Local reporting turns into national reporting, but the sources are really what set good journalists away different from great journalists. And in law enforcement, I had informants. I could tell you anything going on in the town in which I worked, whether it was the drug trade or the gun trade or whatever homicides. I just pick up, I knew which informants to call. Same thing, sources. Hey, what do you hear about this? I don't know. Find out for me. Get back to me. Same thing.
Well, and Scott, I'm glad you mentioned the similarity between journalists and law enforcement in that context. I wonder when it's the opposite scenario, when you are parachuting in, right? Whether you're a national journalist or perhaps you work for a regional news outlet, and the unfortunate reality is your newspaper has cut back and there's something that happens sort of on the edge of your coverage area, a rural area, a couple counties over, but still within your sort of metropolitan region. And so you're entering a situation where unfortunately you haven't had time to cultivate sources ahead of time. In that situation, I wonder if there are any approaches that you, Scott, or others on the panel would recommend when you are kind of coming in cold, and there's a significant news story that's playing out relatively quickly, and you have to get up to speed in relatively short order.
So I was chief of public affairs for ATF for about 4.5 years and developed a strategy of engaging the media. And we addressed this issue with all of our public information officers. My father was a journalist. I come from a journalist background. So to short answer your question is quite simply this, is you get out there, the media, I'm going to say something, don't punch me, the media gets managed by law enforcement. We train people how to manage the media. That's the way it is. So what you have to do is you have to break out of that managed mode. And how you do that is you go out on the side and you say, hey, I'm from you know, WHYY, I listen to you, I'm out of DC, so I listen all the time. But you say, hey, I'm from this, I just want to talk to you about a few things. Oh, okay, what, and you set the ground rules. Off the record, not for attribution, background only, I just need to understand what's going on. Now you're actually starting to say, okay, I'm not on the record, everything I say, and then the guard goes down, and then you start developing that quick rapport that then you can later use during the conference and then start to work outside the conference. So what we instruct public information officers do before you do or police officers do before a conference, a media event, is to tell all the reporters, okay, what are you guys hearing? What do you have? What questions do you have? This is off the record. Tell me now, I'll get the answer. So when I do the presser, it's more beneficial to everybody, and I can answer your questions. I don't sit there and go, I have to get back to you, I have to get back to you. And so right there, we try to build that rapport, usually about 30 minutes ahead of time for people who just arrived. And then some people will say, oh, well, I've got this and this and this, and be like, that's not true. Next one, I've got this. Let me look into that. Or we heard that this happened. Let me get back to you on that. But when I get back, it's get back. Then they know that when the presser starts, they ask the question, then I'll have the answer. So it's just that real quick, down and dirty. What do you know? What do I know? Open the kimono. Everybody's on level ground.
And for the crowd, we have about 20 minutes left. If anybody wants to jump in, just raise your hand or shout at me if I miss you.
Can I just add really quick on that, like being an outsider question? Can you find a reporting partner who is not at your outlet, but who your manager might let you collaborate with? So like this has worked for me. There are a lot of hyper-local like papers and community radio stations in Philadelphia, and WHYY has like a partnership with them where like we give, you know, some media training, they come to a lot of our events, and we will sometimes run their stuff. And so one of those media partners is a Black Muslim woman who is like really ingrained in that community. And there had been shootings around mosques, and I was hearing it was a problem, and imams were getting involved, but like I don't know the imams. And I said, hey, Saj, do you want to report this story with me? Like, can you help connect me to some imams? And she did, and she also knew like Muslim mothers who had lost children. And I sort of did some of the nuts and bolts of getting it packaged for WHYY. So like then her work gets elevated and I got access. So I don't know, it's something that you have to kind of work out structurally, but if you can make a reporting collab happen with somebody who is like a credible messenger in the subject area, it was awesome for me. I learned a ton.
Yeah. As journalists, we all spend at least some of our time playing an adversarial role, right? Asking tough questions of public officials, law enforcement, politicians, candidates, whatever. But Sammy, you said something earlier that I thought was really interesting, and I want to ask Jill, maybe you could jump in as well, and Javier. When you have a situation where it has been hard work to get someone to share their story, and they want some measure of control over that story, right? And you're not playing an adversarial role. This is not asking the mayor a tough question and the answer is the answer and that's the news, right? Are you comfortable with sharing details about what your story is going to look like, how you're going to frame what they have shared with you, with those sources, and how do those conversations go?
I mean, we have been open to that in the past. We have, of course, discussed it ahead of time with whatever story it is. But there is a family of a man who was killed by police, who was having a mental health crisis. And we knew we wanted to sit down with the family, and we knew we wanted to, let them know that they could be a part of the process, and that we were going to be open to, as opposed to sometimes you won't do that at all as a journalist. But yes, we have been open to that, and we've allowed families and individuals to be a part of the process, and maybe not the last edit at the end of the day,
right.
But to allow them. to work with us. I think that's made sense for us in a number of situations.
Yeah, is there any sort of negotiation there where you let them know, like, hey, this is not the last you're going to hear from me, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a huge part of it, is continuing to be with them and continuing to let them know that that we're not, forgetting this. I mean, I still talk to this family. This is still an ongoing issue, and letting them know that you're going to be there still, and that they still have a say in how their son's story is told.
I've had reporters. I've given interviews where reporters they've offered up. I let them offer it up themselves. Hey, I'll tell you what. Let me do a read through with you, just to make sure I'm 100% accurate on this. And actually, I appreciate that. And I have some who don't, and that's okay too. When they get it wrong, if they get it wrong, they get called on it. But for those who don't, we read through it, and I'll say, no, you got that wrong. You heard that wrong. Let's do this. And actually, it makes from my perspective and from my role, it actually makes it a more robust piece, because I'll start adding in other things, or they'll say, hey, I could really use a strong quote here, and I'll give them a strong quote, and then and so their piece actually gets a lot better. It's 100% accurate, and they know that and they actually get more for attribution through that way. Some don't want to do that, and that's okay, but I've made a lot of calls to a lot of editors saying, hey, your guy got it wrong, and I want a retraction. So always that.
I mean, journalism is transactional, right? I mean, it always is sitting with a source, and they give you information, and you're going to publish the information that they give you. It's always established that you have something to give, they have something to give, and each one of us is going to take something. But it's not as absolute as it sounds, because, again, situation matters. And while, for example, you would not give a public official the benefit, for example, of say, retroactive background, right? It's like he calls you, I told you something on the record, can you put it off the record, or can you put it on background? He says, no, that ship already sailed. Or can you change this, or can you change that? Maybe you wouldn't cut the public official any slack, but maybe a trauma victim you would, because of what they went through, because of what they suffer, and because of, they could have chosen not to talk to you. They were they're not public figures. They probably didn't have any reason to talk to you. And many times, and I'm sure everybody's confronted this at some point or another, people, especially trauma victims or relatives of victims, they're very skittish, and they're very nervous, and they're very, they ask you all the time, so what are you going to write about? How are you going to write this? This thing I told you, how are you going to put it in the story? How's it going to appear in the story? They seem to want to know, because I don't know if they want to know that they'll be portrayed accurately, that you're going to do justice to them. But I found a lot of people that they get kind of nervous about that. And so you need to calm them down, because that's also a way to keep them, to get them to keep talking to you. So maybe you can agree to something that if they tell you, I think I told you something, but, on second thought, I wouldn't want it, to appear. Maybe because they talk bad about somebody and they change their mind or whatever. And so you can assess the situation, and you said, okay, I'm gonna take this out. I think in the case of trauma reporting, you have to be very flexible, because these people are sharing a lot, right? And what they're giving you is not easy for them, so you have to accommodate that.
Those are excellent, Javier, points. I think the one thing that when you were talking that really made me think is that, one of the biggest mistakes a lot of journalists make, and I'll give you a great example here in a second. I know you know about this, Eric, is there becomes a laziness that just exists, where people are like, well, I'm just going to take this one source. I'm not going to try to check it out. I'm not going to get multiple sources. That one source is good enough, and especially if it's a source not for attribution. If you're going to do something for not to attribution, you got to have multiple sources for not to attribution. You still have to check it out. So the there's a million examples, but the one I'm going to use is a reporter in D.C. had a source within the Montgomery County Police Department during the D.C. sniper case. And a witness of one of the shootings had actually said, I remember seeing a white van. Well, of course, they were at Home Depot in the parking lot. The Home Depot's full of white vans. So then that reporter got the journalist. The journalist says, "Yeah, we're looking into a white van." All of a sudden, every white van from Philadelphia to Baltimore to D.C. to Fredericksburg was being pulled over. People were abandoning them, and law enforcement spent a ton of time chasing white vans down. They were never in a white van, but it was just that one word from that one witness that then got put out there, and then every news outlet for 3 weeks was all about the white van because they started just repeating what each other said, and there was no validation or verification. So sourcing, if you're going to use sources, you have to take the moment to validate it, verify it, or find multiple sources. And especially when they say not for attribution, okay. Well, then you better find somebody on the record or find 3 or 4 others off the who aren't going to do it that'll validate that.
I began this by asking about how journalists enter these spaces where they're seeking to conduct trauma reporting, but I also wonder if any of you have ever found yourself, I think this is a question that applies in a law enforcement context as well, needing to physically move the space. In other words, take your subject somewhere else, somewhere they might be more comfortable, somewhere away from perhaps the chaos of the moment where you're trying to interview them. Is that something any of you have ever done, and if so, why? What would be a scenario where you would need to do that?
For real quick, so it's kind of a yes or no. There's times where you want to keep them right where they are, and then there's times where you want to get them away, and you just have to be able to read that person, read that situation. By keeping them there, you increase the trauma. They're reliving it over and over again, but also you want them to be in a safe space. So but it's very hard to start moving people around, and I mean, from my perspective, I just invite them down for a conversation in the office, but which is not really what journalists have the opportunity to do.
This isn't in the moment per se, but police shot a teenager fatally. There was a funeral that was public. They were like, it's an officer, it's a police use of force situation, you gotta go to the funeral, right? And I did not approach the parents at the funeral. I just was not going to, actively grieving, right? I didn't really talk to anybody at the funeral. I talked to a few of his friends, but pretty much I just hung out and took notes. I did a story the next day. Then the family contacted me and they said, we liked your story. Do you want to come to our house? It doesn't always happen that way, but if you can show respect and if you can, I told the story of their kid. That's what they wanted. They wanted their kid's legacy to be known, and I was able to do that just from the speeches at the funeral. That was enough. And then I was able to go to their house and spend an hour and a half with them and do the kind of caring kind of interview that I would want to do that you can't do on a scene. You can't have a sit down and have people breathe and give them tissues. You can't do that when you're actively reporting. So sometimes you just have to wait.
I haven't had any case that I can remember any case where one of my reporters has had to get somebody out of that space. I have had some cases where I get or somebody else gets the idea of, for example, let's take one of the victims to the crime scene and interview them there. I said, no, that's just going to pull a lot of triggers for this person, right? It's just a really bad idea. And also because you need to avoid the situations. If you're going to interview someone, that you start setting off all of the triggers that might cause them to re-traumatize or re-victimize, relive the tragedy over again. I've had other cases of what Scott was saying, but you want to keep somebody right where they are. I remember once, and this I think was one of the first times as a reporter very early in my career where I came across or encountered a person who had just suffered a trauma covering the aftermath of a hurricane in southern Mexico in the state of Chiapas. And I was embedded with a Red Cross team. And we came to this village that was completely buried in mud, from a hill that just came, washing down from the rain. And they were starting to bring some people back to see what they could salvage because all of the houses were completely buried. And I remember it was 3 a.m. maybe. I remember this guy just digging the shovel, just shoveling sand and shoveling. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm digging on my tractor, because we got buried, and I need my tractor if I want to start working again." So I remember that, the only way I'm going to talk to this guy is if I stay here with this guy. And if I, just keep talking to him, I'm just going to keep distracting him, and he's got a shovel to get his tractor out. So what I did was I asked, "Well, do you have another shovel?" Right? And so we started shoveling, both of us, the sand, and we were talking. Right? It gets easier, and you get the conversation easier. The guy had to be there anyway, right? So you might as well be helpful if you're at it.
I love it. We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to see if anybody has any questions. Yeah, please jump in and hang tight. We'll get you.
Thank you. Can I ask, especially when you're talking to people, survivors of sexual violence, how do you go about, I never want to pressure someone into talking, but you also do want to instill, I guess, a sense of importance of the potential impact and the power of speaking out. How do you balance, not pressuring, but also you want to say part of it is why you're doing this and why it would be important, why you'd approach them in the first place. How do you balance that?
Great question. I'm so glad you brought up impact. I think journalists are afraid to say that we want our work to have impact. Look, I'm not an activist. I'm not going to City Hall and saying fund, testing rape kits. No, I'm a journalist. But I think it's fair to say we see that the system is not working. Law enforcement says the system is not working. They're working with us too. I've interviewed them and they're yeah, we can't solve these cases. We're having a hard time. Women aren't reporting. They've got an incentive. They want women to report, right? And I'm okay, if you want women to report, then what needs to change on your end? And asking women who did report, what needs to change? So saying that, our goal here is to improve the system felt fine for our editors. We talked about that. We're that's a stance we can take. We can say we want this to be a better experience for people who have been victims of sexual assault. And telling survivors from the get-go, hey, this is what we'd like to do, and law enforcement is involved. They have to know that this is still a balanced story. We are talking to the cops. What we ended up making was a guide to reporting sexual assault in Sacramento County, which had not existed. And it was this big digital document that had it was clickable, it had steps, it had phone numbers, and it was sourced from survivors from crisis centers and from the police. And everybody fact-checked it, everybody looked at it, and it's a resource that's being used now. So if you can make something that's tangible, that there's a real impact in your community, people will buy into it. People will want to be part of that.
Yeah, I love that point because, as journalists, we're so hesitant to predict outcomes, right? How do you have that conversation with a source where you kind of make the point that at least people will know, right? At least people will understand the problem. It may not fix it. These are often sources who are desperate to see whatever it is you're covering fixed, right? They want it to be better. How do you make that approach where you're sort of explaining the potential impact without being predictive about what will happen at the end of it, or without trying to make any sort of guarantee, right? Does that?
Yeah, I think it's what you just said. There's no guarantee. I'm not promising you anything. I'm telling you my intention. I'm telling you how I plan to do it, what steps we're going to take, but we don't know the outcome. And clearance rates for sexual assault are probably not going to change immediately in Sacramento County. They might never. But I think you can say information is always better, right? Taking a problem and putting it into the light is better, and putting out solutions is better than only talking about problems. And that doesn't mean those solutions will come to fruition.
Please jump in.
When I was covering cartel violence in my city, so around 2012, city basically became it had the highest homicide rate in Mexico for that year. And we were just putting out stories about how crime was going up and how the authorities were, incapable of fighting the criminal organizations that were terrorizing the city and so on. So I get a call from the mayor one day. He has a source that I had developed from before he was mayor. So we had a good personal relationship. We always kept a back channel open for cases of emergency, regardless of what we were printing about his administration in the newspaper. But I get a call from him and he says, I need you to help me get the attention of the federal government because they are taking away federal police and military personnel. He said, we can't do it alone. And one of the reasons that the city government was failing was because they were left alone by other levels of government, state, federal levels of government. So he offered me to give me some information that we could put out about how the Army was taking troops out of the city. And because the Army never publicized that. And I agreed to run that. And the rationale that we used is, this is a way that might help the city. If we can call attention to the fact that we are being left alone, that the local government is being left alone, and that, the community is, just left to fend off for themselves. So again, you need to enter into these sorts of transactions in which maybe as a journalist, you do become a bit of an activist, because part of our job eventually became, how do we call the attention to the issue that the city is on fire? We have 3 or 4 homicides a day on average, beat the bodies being dumped in the streets and all that, all that stuff. There comes a point where you just don't report it. You have to do advocacy or activism or something, because reporting it has not been enough to improve the situation. It's murky. It's a very fine line ethically. There might be some people that would have problems with that, but I guess that once you're in the thick of it, your perspective really changes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here we go.
When covering a systemic issue like drug cartels or if there's an issue with law enforcement, how do you weigh the physical safety of yourself and your sources against the importance of telling the story?
It's a great question, but a tough one.
No, it is a great question. It really has a simple answer. Well, it has an answer that is both simple and very complicated. The simple one is, no story is worth a life, right? And that is something that kept repeating in the newsroom. Do we do this story? And I said, well, we're going to get in a lot of trouble, and we might, we're going to step in some toes. When you have a story that you are sure that is going to cause harm to a reporter or to your staff, or you're going to get our offices attacked, you don't run it, right? I mean, if you're certain that you're going to get in trouble, then you would choose not to run it, because you would never risk somebody for running a story. But that's not the case. Those cases in which things are so clear cut are really not that frequent. The most frequent cases are the ones where you don't know, where you're not sure if the story is going to get you in trouble. So you run the story, and so you have to live with, especially as an editor, we have to live with the uncertainty that the decision that you made is going to get somebody in trouble or put somebody in danger. That is really the most challenging part. There's really not a formula to weigh the pros and cons of it. We try to do a little bit of getting into the criminal's mind and see how they operated and see what were the subjects that sort of triggered some repercussions. We could never draw some firm conclusions out of that. So I guess it's, if you're not sure, you have to run the story if, the story has the elements worth running it. Will it have impact? Is it helpful to the community? You're not just going to run a morbid story just for the sake of it and get somebody in danger. That's not the point. I mean, if you're trying to really perform a service, then you have to meet that obligation. But it's always going to be a coin toss.
Have any of you reported in a scenario where perhaps your news organization has sent security with you, or you take a second journalist, maybe a photographer or another reporter, and probably you have a backstory, this person's here to shoot photos or whatever, but it's because you're entering a potentially unsafe environment? Is that a tactic any of you have ever used? And if so, what's kind of been the context?
Yeah, I'll talk briefly about my newsroom's coverage of the George Floyd demonstrations in Sacramento. Probably other people in this room covered demonstrations in their own cities. We never sent a reporter out alone. We always had 2 or 3. We always had an editor who was checking in with those reporters every 30 minutes by cell phone. We had the option to have bulletproof vests. We had the option to have full masks for tear gas. We weren't required. We had really visible press vests and hats because we were afraid that we might get arrested. There was a moment in my town where the protesters went onto the interstate. I called my editor and I said, hey, I feel safe going on the interstate. I've got my press stuff. Do you want me to go? And he said, only if you feel safe, you do not have to go. So I think just having those constant lines of communication and also having shifts. Nobody was allowed to cover the protest for more than 2 days. If you did 2 days in a row, you're tapped out, somebody else is going in, because you will burn yourself out. And when you're tired, you will make dangerous decisions. When you're alone, you'll make dangerous decisions. So have a team, have a system.
I really hate to cut it off now because this is a really interesting conversation, but we are out of time. Thank you all so much, and I think you all are headed that way, is that right? Okay. Good deal. All right. Well, thank you all.
Thanks.